The rattlesnake's warning came too late for Deborah Nelson, as she stumbled back from the edge of the dry creek bed, her heart pounding like a war drum against her ribs. The creature slithered away into the brush, leaving her alone with the harsh truth. Stillwater was failing her, just as everything else in her life had done. The spring of 1875 had brought nothing but dust and disappointment to Oklahoma territory. Deborah wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, her blonde hair escaping from its practical bun. At 26, she was the last Nelson standing, the sole proprietor of a struggling cattle ranch that had been her father's pride and joy before consumption took him 3 months prior. She kicked at the dry earth with her worn boot, frustration bubbling up inside her chest. The water level in the creek had dropped again. Soon there would be nothing left for her cattle to drink, nothing left for her, either. "Talking to yourself again, Miss Nelson," the deep voice startled her. She whirled around, hand instinctively going to the small revolver tucked in her skirt pocket. A tall man stood several yards away, astride a chestnut gelding. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see enough to know he was a stranger. "Who's asking?" She replied, not removing her hand from her pocket. The man dismounted with ease, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Name's Jack Ryder. Your neighbor to the north sent me this way. Said you might need some help with your herd." Deborah's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Old man Peterson had mentioned sending someone her way, but she hadn't expected anyone so soon. Or someone who looked like this man, tall and broad-shouldered with a face that seemed more suited to city life than the harsh Oklahoma frontier. "I don't recall asking for help, Mr. Ryder," he chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "No, madam, I don't suppose you did. But Peterson said your father passed recently, and running a ranch alone is near impossible, even for the most capable person." "And you think I'm not capable?" she challenged, chin lifting. "I think you're standing at a dry creek bed looking like you might cry or shoot something, possibly both." His frankness surprised her. "And I think your cattle need water before you lose the whole herd." He wasn't wrong. She had 52 head of cattle left, and 2 had already died from lack of water. If the drought continued, she'd lose everything her father had worked for. "I can pay you fair wages, but not until I sell some cattle," she said finally. Jack Ryder shook his head. "Don't worry about that now. First things first, we need to get water to your herd. I know a place about 5 miles west where there's still good water running. We can drive them there tomorrow." She studied him carefully. He was offering help with no immediate payment, which made no sense. Men didn't just appear offering charity, especially not to women alone. "What's your angle, Mr. Ryder?" He looked genuinely confused. "Angle? Why would you help a stranger for no guaranteed payment?" Jack shifted his weight, adjusting his hat in his hands. "I've been riding for months looking for work and a place to settle. Peterson said you needed help, and I need something steady. Simple as that." There was more to his story, she could sense it, but the desperation of her situation outweighed her caution. One more dead cow and she might as well pack up and head east, tail between her legs like her mother had done years ago. "Fine," she said. "You can sleep in the barn tonight. We'll move the herd at dawn." His smile was quick and bright. "Yes, madam." "And Mr. Ryder?" "Yes. I keep a shotgun by my bed and I'm a very light sleeper." He nodded, expression serious now. "Wouldn't expect anything less, Miss Nelson." The following morning came with a blaze of pink and gold across the horizon. Deborah was already saddled up and waiting when Jack emerged from the barn, looking surprisingly fresh for a man who'd slept on hay. "Morning," he called, swinging up onto his gelding with practiced ease. Deborah nodded in acknowledgement, already focused on the task ahead. The herds gathered in the south pasture. Most are still strong enough to make the trip, but there are a few that might give us trouble. Jack followed her gaze to where her small herd of longhorns grazed on what little vegetation remained. Even from a distance, it was clear some were struggling, their ribs visible through dull hides. "We'll take it slow with the weak ones," he said. "Better to arrive with all of them than lose a few trying to hurry." They worked in surprisingly comfortable silence, moving around the cattle with a rhythm that suggested they'd been working together for years, not hours. Deborah was impressed despite herself. Jack knew cattle, knew how to move them without causing panic, knew which ones needed extra attention. By midday, they had successfully moved the herd to the water source Jack had mentioned, a small river fed by underground springs that seemed untouched by the drought. The cattle drank eagerly, some nearly collapsing in their desperation to reach the water. Deborah dismounted, letting her own horse drink while she watched the cattle. Relief loosened the knot that had been sitting in her chest for weeks. They weren't saved yet, but this was breathing room. "Thank you," she said quietly when Jack came to stand beside her. He shrugged, but she could see he was pleased by her acknowledgement. "This water should hold through summer, but you'll need to think about what comes next." "What do you mean?" "Your land's good, Miss Nelson, but that creek running through your property isn't reliable. You need to think about digging a well, maybe building some irrigation from this river." She sighed, pushing back a strand of hair that had escaped her braid. "That takes money, Mr. Ryder." "Money I don't have until I can get these cattle to market. When's the next cattle drive to the railroad? 3 weeks, but my cattle aren't in good enough condition to fetch top dollar." Jack considered this, eyes scanning the herd thoughtfully. 3 weeks of good water and grazing could make a difference, and I know some buyers who might pay better than the usual middlemen. Deborah looked at him sharply. "You know cattle buyers?" A shadow passed over his face. "I used to work for a big outfit in Texas, made some connections." There it was again, that sense he was holding something back, but she couldn't deny his knowledge or the fact that he'd already saved her herd from certain death. "All right, Mr. Ryder, you've earned your keep for today. Let's get these cattle settled here, then we can discuss what happens next." As the days passed, Deborah found herself growing accustomed to Jack's presence. He worked from sunrise to sunset, never complaining about the heat or the physical demands of ranch work. He repaired fences, tended to the weaker cattle, and even fixed the leaking roof of her small cabin one afternoon when a rare summer thunderstorm rolled through. They established a routine, taking meals together in her small kitchen, discussing the day's work and plans for the next. Jack was surprisingly well-read for a cowhand, occasionally quoting literature that reminded her of the books her father had loved. "Where did you learn about Emerson?" she asked one evening as they ate a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and rabbit stew. Jack paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. "My mother was a school teacher before she married my father. She made sure I had books, even when we didn't have much else." "And your father," a tension entered his shoulders. "Rancher, died when I was 15. "I'm sorry," she said, recognizing the brief flicker of old pain in his eyes. The same pain she felt when thinking of her own father. "It was a long time ago." He changed the subject. "I was thinking we should start moving the strongest cattle back to your property tomorrow. I found some good grazing land on the northwest corner that's still green. If we rotate them between here and there, we might fatten them up faster before the drive." She nodded, grateful for his expertise, but also aware that she was becoming dependent on him. It was dangerous territory for a woman who had learned the hard way that depending on others only led to disappointment. The next morning, they separated 20 of the strongest cattle to drive back to her property. The work was hot and dusty, but there was a satisfaction in seeing the animals respond well to the improved conditions. As they finished settling the cattle in the northwestern pasture, a rider approached from the direction of town. Deborah recognized Thomas Wilson, the banker's son, who had made his interest in both her and her land clear since her father's death. "Miss Nelson," Thomas called, tipping his hat as he drew his horse to a stop. His eyes flickered to Jack with obvious displeasure. "I see you've hired help." "Mr. Wilson," she acknowledged coolly. "What brings you out this way?" Thomas dismounted, brushing dust from his too fine clothes. He always dressed as though Stillwater were a city rather than a frontier town. "I came to check on you, of course. My father and I have been concerned about your welfare." His gaze traveled over her property with poorly disguised calculation, times being what they are with the drought and all. "As you can see, we're managing fine," she replied. Thomas raised an eyebrow at her use of we, looking at Jack with renewed interest. "And you are Jack Ryder," Jack said simply, not offering his hand. "Ryder," Thomas repeated as though testing the name. "Can't say I've heard of you before. Where do you hail from, Mr. Ryder?" "Here and there," Jack answered, his expression giving nothing away. Thomas turned back to Deborah. "Miss Nelson, I wonder if I might have a word with you, in private." Deborah hesitated, then nodded to Jack. "Would you mind checking on that fence line we discussed?" Jack looked between them, clearly reluctant to leave her alone with Thomas, but he respected her authority. "Yes, madam. I'll be within shouting distance if you need anything." Once Jack was out of earshot, Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice confidentially. "Deborah, I must express my concern about you employing a drifter. Do you know anything about this man, his background, his character?" "I know he's helped save my cattle when no one else offered assistance," she replied pointedly. Thomas had the grace to look slightly abashed, but pressed on. "My father asked me to remind you that our offer to purchase your land still stands. In fact, given the difficult conditions, we're prepared to increase it by 15%. Deborah's spine stiffened. The Wilsons had been trying to buy her father's land for years, always offering below market value. Even with the increase, she knew their offer would be far less than the ranch was worth. "My answer remains the same, Thomas. This ranch is not for sale." His expression hardened slightly. "You're being unreasonable, Deborah. A woman alone cannot run a cattle operation successfully, especially in these conditions. It's only a matter of time before you're forced to sell or worse, lose everything to foreclosure." "I'm not alone anymore," she said before she could stop herself. Thomas's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. "You barely know this man. For all you know, he could be planning to steal your cattle or—" He let the implication hang in the air. "That will be all, Mr. Wilson," Deborah said coldly. "Please convey my response to your father. The Nelson Ranch is not for sale, not now, not ever." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he maintained his polite facade as he remounted his horse. "Think carefully about your situation, Deborah. Not all offers remain open indefinitely." With a final nod, he turned his horse and rode away. Jack returned moments later, his expression questioning. "Everything all right?" Deborah watched Thomas's retreating figure, a knot forming in her stomach. "The Wilsons want my land. They've been after it since before my father died." "They'll have to find another piece to add to their collection," Jack said firmly. She looked at him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. "You don't know the Wilsons. Thomas's father owns half the businesses in town and has most of the county officials in his pocket." "I know his type," Jack said darkly. "Men who think everything and everyone has a price." There was something in his tone that made Deborah wonder again about his past, but she didn't press. They all had secrets after all. "We should get back to work," she said instead. "There's still daylight left." As the days passed, the cattle grew stronger. With access to water and better grazing, they began to put on weight, their coats becoming glossier. Deborah's spirits lifted with each visible improvement. Maybe, just maybe, she could make this work. Jack proved himself invaluable, not just with the cattle but around the ranch. He seemed to anticipate problems before they arose, making small repairs and improvements that Deborah might never have thought of. In the evenings, they would sit on her small porch, watching the sunset and talking about the day's work. Gradually, their conversations extended beyond ranch business. Jack spoke of his travels across the West, of the mountains in Colorado and the vast plains of Texas. Deborah told him about growing up on the ranch, learning cattle work from her father while her mother dreamed of returning to Philadelphia society. "She left when I was 16, Deborah confessed one evening. Said she couldn't take another winter out here. Promised to send for me once she was settled back east." She paused, the old hurt still tender after all these years. "Never did, though." Jack was quiet for a moment. "Some people aren't made for this life. And some make promises they never intend to keep," she replied, more bitterness in her voice than she'd intended. Jack studied her in the fading light. "Is that why you're so determined to make it on your own? Because everyone else has left?" The question struck too close to home. Deborah stood abruptly. "It's getting late. We have an early start tomorrow." If Jack was hurt by her sudden withdrawal, he didn't show it. He simply nodded, respecting her boundaries. "Good night, Miss Nelson." "Good night, Mr. Ryder." That night, Deborah lay awake longer than usual, Jack's question echoing in her mind. Was that truly why she fought so hard to remain independent? Because she feared being abandoned again. Her father had been the only one who'd never let her down, who'd stayed until death took him. Everyone else, her mother, childhood friends who'd moved away, even a young man she'd once thought she might marry, all had left Stillwater, left her behind. A week before the cattle drive was scheduled to begin, Jack rode into Stillwater to make arrangements with the buyers he'd mentioned. Deborah used the day to catch up on household chores, trying to ignore how quiet the ranch seemed without him. She was hanging laundry when she heard horses approaching. Looking up, she was surprised to see not Jack returning, but Thomas Wilson accompanied by his father, Harold, and the county sheriff. "Miss Nelson," Harold Wilson called out as they dismounted. He was a portly man with cold eyes that never matched his businessman's smile. "I hope we're not intruding." Deborah straightened, instinctively wary. "What can I do for you gentlemen?" Sheriff Davis looked uncomfortable, not meeting her eyes as Harold Wilson took charge of the conversation. "We've come on a matter of some delicacy, my dear. It concerns your employee, Jack Ryder." A chill ran down Deborah's spine despite the warm day. "What about him?" Harold produced a folded paper from his jacket. "It seems Mr. Ryder is not who he claims to be. Sheriff Davis received this telegram this morning from authorities in Texas." The sheriff finally spoke, his voice gruff. "There's a warrant out for his arrest, Miss Nelson, for cattle rustling and the murder of a ranch foreman near San Antonio." Deborah's world tilted. "That's impossible. There must be some mistake." "I'm afraid not," Thomas said, his expression a poor imitation of sympathy. "The description matches perfectly. Jack Ryder is a wanted man." "His real name isn't even Ryder," Harold added. "It's John Jackson. Ryder is just an alias he's been using." Deborah's mind raced. She thought of Jack's reluctance to discuss his past, his knowledge of cattle operations, his connections with buyers. Could it be true? Had she invited a criminal into her home, trusted him with her livelihood? "Where is he now?" Sheriff Davis asked. "In town," she answered automatically. "Making arrangements for the cattle drive." The three men exchanged looks. "We'll head back and apprehend him," the sheriff said. Miss Nelson, I advise you to stay here. If he returns, don't confront him. He's considered dangerous." Harold Wilson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Deborah, in light of these unfortunate circumstances, I must insist you reconsider our offer. You're alone again, and with your cattle drive plans now in jeopardy." Anger flared through her confusion. "My answer remains the same, Mr. Wilson. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Harold's face hardened momentarily before his businessman's mask slipped back into place. "As you wish. But do consider your position carefully. A woman alone in these parts faces many challenges." After they departed, Deborah sat heavily on the porch steps, her mind in turmoil. She didn't want to believe Jack was capable of murder or theft. In the weeks they'd worked together, she'd come to trust him, perhaps even care for him more than was wise. But doubt had taken root. What did she really know about Jack Ryder? He'd appeared when she was at her most vulnerable, worked his way into her confidence, and now was conveniently in town making arrangements for her cattle arrangements she knew nothing about. The sound of an approaching horse snapped her out of her thoughts. She stood quickly, heart pounding as she recognized Jack's chestnut gelding. For a wild moment, she considered running inside for her shotgun, but something held her back. Jack's face broke into a smile when he saw her, but it quickly faded as he drew closer. "What's wrong?" he asked, dismounting swiftly. Deborah crossed her arms, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sheriff Davis was here, with the Wilsons." Jack went very still, his expression unreadable. "I see." "Is it true?" she demanded. "Are you wanted for rustling cattle, for murder?" He didn't answer immediately, his eyes searching hers. Finally, he sighed deeply. "It's complicated, Deborah. That's not a denial. No, it's not." He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his distress. "There is a warrant, yes. But I didn't murder anyone, and I'm not a rustler." "Then explain," she said, hating the slight quaver in her voice. Jack glanced toward the road leading to town. "We don't have much time if the sheriff's coming after me." "You're not going anywhere until I get the truth," she insisted, though her heart was pounding with fear of his answers, fear of losing him, fear of having been wrong about him. Jack nodded slowly. "I worked for the Circle M Ranch in Texas. The owner's son was stealing cattle and selling them across the border. When I discovered what was happening, I confronted him. There was a fight. The foreman, his cousin, came at me with a knife. It was self-defense, Deborah, I swear it. But the owner's son claimed I was the rustler, that I killed the foreman when he caught me. His father owns half the county, just like Wilson here. No one would take my word against theirs." The story was all too believable, echoing her own situation with the Wilsons. But could she trust him? "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Pain flashed across his features. "Because I wanted to be Jack Ryder, not John Jackson the fugitive. Because for the first time in 2 years, I found a place where I might belong." His voice dropped lower. "Someone I might belong with." The sincerity in his eyes made her heart ache. Before she could respond, they both heard the sound of approaching riders. "You need to go," she said urgently. He shook his head. "If I run, it only makes me look guilty, and I won't leave you to face this alone. Don't be a fool, Jack." "They'll hang you." "I'm done running," he said firmly. "But I need you to believe me, Deborah. I've never lied to you about anything that matters." She studied his face, the face that had become so dear to her over these weeks. In her heart, she knew he was telling the truth. "I believe you." Relief washed over his features, followed quickly by determination. "Then we'll face this together." The sheriff arrived with the Wilsons and 2 deputies, all with weapons drawn. "John Jackson," Sheriff Davis called, "you're under arrest for cattle rustling and the murder of Frank Pearson. Come out with your hands up." Jack stepped forward, hands raised. "Sheriff, I'm not resisting, but I'd like to explain my side of the story." "Save it for the judge," Harold Wilson interrupted. "We have the telegram right here confirming your crimes." "A telegram from the Circle M Ranch, I'd wager," Jack replied calmly. "Owned by Maxwell Montgomery, whose son is the real cattle rustler." Thomas Wilson scoffed. "A likely story from a man facing the gallows." "It's the truth," Jack insisted, "and I can prove it." This caught the sheriff's attention. "How's that?" "I kept records. Dates, numbers, where the cattle were sold. I wasn't able to take them with me when I fled, but I hid them on the Circle M property. If someone were to telegraph the ranch foreman who replaced Pearson, a man named Daniel Cooper, he could confirm my story." Cooper suspected what was happening, but was too afraid to speak up while I was there. Sheriff Davis hesitated, clearly torn between his duty and the possibility that an innocent man stood before him. "This is absurd," Harold Wilson blustered. "You can't seriously be considering the word of a known criminal over an official warrant." Deborah stepped forward. "Sheriff Davis, I've worked alongside Jack or John for weeks now. He's had every opportunity to steal my cattle or harm me, yet he's done nothing but help save my ranch. Doesn't that count for something?" The sheriff rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "It might at that, Miss Nelson. But the law is the law. I need to take him in until we can verify his story." "Then I'm coming too," she stated firmly. "Deborah, no," Jack protested. "Yes," she insisted. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone." The ride to Stillwater was tense. Jack rode with his hands bound, flanked by deputies, while Deborah followed on her own horse, ignoring Thomas Wilson's attempts to dissuade her. At the small jailhouse, Sheriff Davis allowed Deborah to speak with Jack briefly before locking him in a cell. "This is madness," she said, voice low and urgent. "You should have run when you had the chance." Jack shook his head. "No more running. Besides," he added with a small smile, "if I'd run, who would help you with that cattle drive?" Despite everything, she found herself smiling back. "You're either the bravest or the most foolish man I've ever met, Jack Ryder." His expression sobered. "Whatever happens, Deborah, know that these weeks with you have been worth it, worth everything." Before she could respond, Sheriff Davis approached. "Time to lock up Miss Nelson. I've sent telegrams to Texas asking about this Cooper fella and requesting verification of the charges. Should hear back in a day or two." "And until then," she demanded. "Until then, he stays put." The sheriff's tone softened slightly. "I'll make sure he's treated fair, Miss Nelson." "You have my word on that." Deborah had no choice but to return to her ranch alone. The silence that greeted her was oppressive, the empty spaces where Jack should be a constant reminder of how quickly things could change. The next day, she rode back into town, determined to speak with Jack again. To her surprise, she found the jailhouse in an uproar. Sheriff Davis was reading a telegram, his expression thunderous, while Harold Wilson was red-faced with anger. "What's happening?" she demanded. The sheriff looked up. "Got a reply from Texas. Seems Mr. Ryder, or Jackson, was telling the truth. The new foreman at Circle M confirmed his story and provided evidence that Maxwell Montgomery's son was behind the rustling. The murder charge has been dropped. It was ruled self-defense months ago, but that information was suppressed locally." Relief flooded through her. "So he's free to go." "He is," Sheriff Davis confirmed, shooting a hard look at Harold Wilson. "And I'd like to know why you were so fired up to see him arrested, Wilson." "The telegram mentioned you by name, said you'd been in contact with Montgomery about a mutual problem." Harold's face paled. "Business correspondence, nothing more. Business that involved framing an innocent man," the sheriff pressed. Before Harold could respond, Jack emerged from the cell area, rubbing his wrists where the shackles had been. His eyes found Deborah immediately, a smile breaking across his face. "Told you I was innocent," he said, the lightness of his tone belied by the intensity of his gaze. Deborah stepped toward him, uncaring of the onlookers. "Yes, you did. I should have trusted you completely from the start." "You trusted me enough," he replied softly. Sheriff Davis cleared his throat. "Mr. Ryder, or do you prefer Jackson?" "Ryder is fine," Jack said, not taking his eyes off Deborah. "Mr. Ryder, then. You're free to go. My apologies for the inconvenience." Harold Wilson stepped forward, his businessman's mask firmly in place despite his obvious discomfort. "While this misunderstanding has been cleared up, the offer for your ranch still stands, Miss Nelson. Perhaps now more than ever you should consider—" "Mr. Wilson," Deborah interrupted, her voice steel wrapped in silk. "I suggest you leave while the sheriff is still in a mood to let you. I have nothing more to say to you or your son." Harold's mask slipped, revealing the anger beneath. "You'll regret this, both of you. No one crosses Harold Wilson in Stillwater." "Sounds like a challenge," Jack said mildly. "I'm partial to those." After the Wilsons departed, Deborah and Jack walked out into the sunlight. For a moment they stood in silence, absorbing the reality of his freedom, of the possibilities now before them. "The cattle drive is still on," Jack finally said. "I made all the arrangements yesterday before." "Well, before my unexpected stay in the sheriff's accommodations." Deborah smiled. "Good. We've worked too hard to miss this opportunity." They walked to where their horses were hitched, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them, yet neither quite ready to name it. "Deborah," Jack said as he helped her mount, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for believing in me. Not many would have." She looked down at him, this man who had appeared in her life when she needed him most. "Just don't make me regret it," she said, only half joking. His expression turned serious. "I won't. That's a promise I intend to keep." The cattle drive began 3 days later. With the help of 2 local boys Jack had hired, they moved the now healthy herd toward the railroad shipping point at Guthrie. The journey would take the better part of a week, but the cattle were strong and the weather cooperative. On the 3rd night, as they camped under a canopy of stars with the boys taking first watch over the sleeping herd, Jack and Deborah sat beside the campfire, enjoying a moment of quiet. "What will you do after the cattle are sold?" Deborah asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind finally finding voice. Jack poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the night air. "That depends." "On what?" He looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "On whether I have a reason to stay." Deborah's heart quickened. "The ranch still needs work. That well you mentioned. It would be good to have before next summer." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Is that the only reason you can think of for me to stay?" Her cheeks warmed and she was grateful for the darkness. "Maybe not the only reason." Jack set aside the stick and moved closer to her on the log they shared. "Deborah, I need to be clear about something. I'm not looking for employment. I'm not looking to be your hired hand." "What are you looking for, then?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A home," he said simply. "A place to belong, someone to belong with." The vulnerability in his voice matched the feeling in her own heart. "People don't tend to stay in my life, Jack. They leave one way or another." "Everyone leaves eventually," she said, voicing the fear that had haunted her since her mother's abandonment, a fear that had only grown stronger with her father's death. Jack reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "Then watch me stay for 50 years." The simple declaration, spoken with such certainty, broke something open inside her. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, surprising them both with her boldness. His response was immediate, his free hand coming up to cradle her cheek as he returned the kiss with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally parted, both breathless, his smile was brighter than the stars above them. "I should have done that weeks ago," he murmured. She laughed softly. "I might have shot you if you'd tried." "Worth the risk," he replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. A call from one of the boys interrupted the moment. A few cattle had wandered too far from the herd. Jack squeezed her hand once before standing. "We'll finish this conversation," he promised, his eyes conveying far more than his words. The remainder of the drive passed in a blend of hard work and stolen moments. Something had shifted between them, a mutual acknowledgement of feelings that had been building since that first day at the dry creek bed. When they finally reached Guthrie and delivered the cattle to the buyers Jack had arranged, the price they received exceeded Deborah's highest hopes. It would be enough to see the ranch through the year, to dig the well, to make repairs, and still have something set aside for the future. As they rode back toward Stillwater, their pockets heavy with money and their hearts lighter than they'd been in months, Deborah found herself thinking of that future with Jack beside her. The Nelson Ranch came into view as they crested the final hill, the small cabin and outbuildings bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Deborah reined in her horse, taking in the sight. "Something wrong?" Jack asked, stopping beside her. She shook her head. "No, just seeing it differently, I suppose, seeing possibilities I couldn't before." He followed her gaze, understanding in his eyes. "It's a good piece of land. With that well and maybe some irrigation, it could be great. It could be home," she said softly, looking at him. His smile was slow and sure. "It already is." They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence. As they approached the cabin, however, Deborah noticed something amiss. The door stood ajar and items were scattered across the porch. Jack noticed it too, his posture immediately alert. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, drawing his revolver. They approached cautiously. It was clear someone had ransacked the cabin, furniture overturned, Deborah's few possessions strewn about, even the floorboards in one corner pried up. Who would do this? Deborah whispered, anger and violation warring within her. Jack's expression was grim. "I can think of someone who might want to send a message." "Wilson." She spat the name like a curse. They searched the property, finding similar destruction in the barn and storage shed. Thankfully, the damage was primarily to property, nothing that couldn't be repaired or replaced with the money from the cattle sale. "It could have been worse," Deborah said that evening as they sat on the porch of the partially restored cabin. "They could have burned it all down." Jack's jaw tightened. That would have been too obvious. Wilson's too clever for that. "What do we do now?" "We rebuild," Jack said simply. "We show him and everyone else that it takes more than this to drive us out." Deborah was struck by his use of "we," by how naturally it came to him to include himself in her future. "And when he tries again, because he will, Jack, Harold Wilson doesn't give up on what he wants." Jack took her hand, his expression resolute. "Neither do I. And what I want is a life here with you if you'll have me." Her heart swelled. Despite everything, the vandalism, the lingering drought, the challenges that surely lay ahead, she couldn't imagine facing any of it without him. "I'll have you," she said softly, "for as long as you'll stay." He smiled, that warm, genuine smile that had first caught her attention. 50 years, remember, though I'm hoping for more." She leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. 50 years is a good start. The following weeks were filled with work repairing the damage done to the ranch, beginning excavation for the well, preparing for winter. Word of what had happened spread through Stillwater, and to Deborah's surprise, neighbors began to appear with offers of help. Peterson brought lumber for repairs. The blacksmith's wife arrived with preserved vegetables from her garden. Even Sheriff Davis rode out to check on them, making it clear that he was watching the situation. "Seems Wilson's influence isn't what it used to be," Jack remarked one evening as they watched the sunset from their restored porch. "That telegram from Texas raised some questions about his business dealings." Deborah nodded. "Mrs. Johnson at the general store said there's talk he might sell his interests here and move on. Apparently, his partners back east aren't happy about something." "Couldn't happen to a nicer fellow," Jack said dryly. She laughed, leaning into his side. These quiet evenings had become her favorite part of the day, a time when they could simply be together without the demands of ranch work. "I was thinking," Jack said, his arm around her shoulders. "That cattle drive went well enough that we might consider expanding the herd next spring. With the well nearly finished, we could support more cattle." "We could," she agreed, "though we'd need more help for a larger operation." He was quiet for a moment, his fingers drawing absent patterns on her arm. "Deborah, I've been meaning to ask you something." There was a note in his voice that made her heart quicken. She sat up straighter, turning to face him. "What is it?" Jack took a deep breath. "I know it hasn't been that long, but I think we both know what we've found here is rare. Special." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the fading sunlight. A ring, simple but beautiful, with a small pearl set in silver. "I want to make it official. I want to be your husband, to build this life together properly." Tears pricked at her eyes as he continued. "I can't promise it will always be easy. There will be droughts and hard winters and people like Wilson. But I can promise that I'll be here through all of it. So, Deborah Nelson, will you marry me?" The answer was as clear as the stars now appearing in the darkening sky. "Yes, Jack. Yes, I will." His smile was brighter than she'd ever seen it as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "Where did you get this?" she asked, admiring how the pearl seemed to glow in the twilight. "In Guthrie, while you were arranging the cattle shipment," he admitted. "I've been carrying it since then, waiting for the right moment." She laughed softly. "Even before our first kiss. You were that confident." He shook his head, his expression suddenly serious. "Not confident, hopeful. There's a difference." Deborah leaned forward and kissed him, trying to convey everything she felt, the joy, the love, the certainty that had replaced her old fears. They were married 2 weeks later in Stillwater's small church, with half the town in attendance. Sheriff Davis gave the bride away, and Peterson stood as Jack's best man. Even Thomas Wilson came, offering stiff congratulations and the information that his father had indeed sold his interests and was returning east. "A wedding gift of sorts," Thomas said, his attempt at humor falling flat, but the sentiment seemingly genuine. The celebration continued back at the ranch, neighbors bringing food and music and good wishes. As evening fell and the last guests departed, Deborah and Jack stood on their porch, now truly theirs together. "Mrs. Ryder," Jack said, testing the name with obvious pleasure. "How does it sound?" "Perfect," she replied, her heart fuller than she'd ever thought possible. "Absolutely perfect." That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their cabin, Jack's arms around her and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Deborah reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a dry creek bed and the brink of ruin to this moment of perfect contentment, it seemed almost miraculous. "What are you thinking about?" Jack murmured, his voice drowsy. "How close I came to losing everything," she admitted. "If you hadn't come along when you did." He tightened his arms around her. "But I did, and you would have found a way regardless. You're stronger than you know, Deborah." She smiled against his chest. "Perhaps, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." "Me too," he said softly. "Now get some sleep. We have a ranch to run in the morning." The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. The well proved its worth during the following summer's drought, while the irrigation system Jack designed allowed them to grow crops as well as raise cattle. The herd expanded, as did their operation, eventually employing several hands year-round. In the spring of 1877, their first child was born, a son they named David, after Deborah's father. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Emma, who had Jack's dark hair and Deborah's determined spirit. The Wilsons faded from Stillwater's memory, their properties sold to various townsfolk and surrounding ranchers. The town itself grew, the railroad eventually extending a spur line that made cattle drives to Guthrie unnecessary. Change came to the territory as it did everywhere, but the Nelson Ryder Ranch remained a constant, prospering under their joint care. Through it all, Jack kept his promise. When drought came, he stayed. When blizzards threatened their herd, he stayed. When opportunity called from elsewhere, he stayed. Each challenge faced together strengthened the bond between them, proving what Deborah had once thought impossible, that some people do stay, that love can be as enduring as the land itself. On their 25th wedding anniversary, they hosted a celebration that drew people from miles around. Their children, now young adults with lives of their own beginning, arranged everything, insisting their parents simply enjoy the day. As evening fell and lanterns were lit around the expanded ranch house they'd built 10 years prior, Jack led Deborah away from the festivities to the old cabin, still standing though now used primarily for storage. "Remember our first night here as husband and wife?" he asked, his voice low and intimate despite the silver now threading his dark hair. Deborah smiled, squeezing his hand. "How could I forget? I was so nervous." "You didn't seem it," he recalled, pulling her close. "You seemed absolutely certain." "I was," she said simply. "About you, about us." He kissed her then, with the same tenderness as their first kiss beneath the stars on that cattle drive so many years ago. When they parted, his eyes shone with emotion. 25 years, he said wonderingly. "Halfway to my promise." Deborah laughed, the sound as bright and clear as it had been in her youth. "You're keeping count." "Every day," he affirmed. "Every single day with you is one I'm grateful for." They returned to the celebration, to their children and friends and the life they'd built together. As they danced beneath the stars, Deborah caught glimpses of their past selves, the wary young woman at the dry creek bed, the mysterious cowboy offering help, both guarded, both searching for something they found in each other. The years continued their steady march. David took over more of the ranch operations, introducing new breeding stock and modern techniques learned during his time at an agricultural college back east. Emma married a doctor who set up practice in Stillwater, giving Jack and Deborah 3 grandchildren to dote on. Oklahoma Territory became Oklahoma State. The frontier gave way to settlements, towns to cities. Through it all, the ranch prospered, adapting as needed but never losing the spirit of its founders. In 1925, as their 50th wedding anniversary approached, Jack fell ill. The doctor, their son-in-law, did what he could, but age and a lifetime of hard work had taken their toll. "Don't look so worried," Jack told Deborah as she sat beside his bed one evening, her hand in his. "I've kept my promise. 50 years, just like I said." "Don't you dare talk that way, Jack Ryder," she scolded, though her voice wavered. At 76, her blonde hair had long since turned silver, and lines of laughter marked her face, but her eyes were as bright and determined as ever. "We're not done yet." He smiled, the expression still capable of warming her heart after all these years. "No, we're not, but I want you to know. These 50 years have been the best a man could ask for. You gave me everything I ever wanted, Deborah, a home, a family, love." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "And you gave me the same. You stayed, Jack. When I was so sure no one ever would, you stayed. Best decision I ever made, he whispered, squeezing her hand. To everyone's surprise, perhaps even his own Jack rallied. By their anniversary celebration, he was well enough to stand beside Deborah as they renewed the vows they'd made half a century earlier. Their children, grandchildren, and what seemed like the entire county gathered to witness the event, to celebrate a love that had not only endured but flourished. That evening, as the festivities wound down and their family departed, leaving them alone in the house that had seen so much life, Jack took Deborah's hand. 50 years, he said softly. Promise kept. She looked up at him, this man who had changed her life with his steadfastness, his love, his unwavering belief in their future together. What now? She asked, a smile playing at her lips. Jack's eyes twinkled with the same light that had first captured her heart all those years ago. Now we start working on the next 50. Deborah laughed, the sound as bright and hopeful as a spring morning. I think we might need to be a bit more realistic about our timeline, my love. Perhaps, he conceded, pulling her into his arms, but the principle remains. I'm staying right here, Deborah Ryder, for as long as we have. I never doubted it, she said, resting her head against his chest where his heart still beat strong and true. Not for a single day. And in that moment, surrounded by the life they'd built together, the promise of 50 years fulfilled and yet somehow just the beginning, Deborah knew that some things truly do last forever, not in spite of life's hardships but because of them, strengthened by each challenge faced together, each obstacle overcome side by side. Jack had stayed when everyone else had left. He had given her not just 50 years but a lifetime of love, proving that some promises are made to be kept, that some bonds can never be broken, that home is not a place but a person, a heart, a shared history of moments both ordinary and extraordinary. The years may change the land, may change their bodies, may bring loss and joy in equal measure, but some things remain constant, like a promise made beneath the Oklahoma stars, like love that grows deeper with each passing season, like the certainty that no matter what comes, they would face it together. As they had for 50 years, as they would for whatever time remained, together.